All right, so welcome to our annual discussion on opportunities and trends in data, machine learning, and AI. Our host today will be Jenn Webb, and my collaborator Mikio Braun and I will be the guests. So I'll turn it over to Jenn Webb.
Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. Let's start this year's with a new trend. I don't think we've talked about this before, but the first trend on the list this year is generative AI. Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about how that made the list?
Yeah, so AI funding is still healthy. I mean, it's not, if as I talk to venture capitalists, they'll tell me that at least at the seed stage, there's still a lot of activity, seed stage and Series A. Maybe Series B gets a little tougher. And one of the hot topics that a lot of my VC friends talk about is that they're interested in is generative AI, which I will let Mikio explain what that means. But basically, at a high level, it goes from AI used to be something you would use to do things like classification, clustering, prediction. Now AI can be used to make things, so creative expression. So some of the manifestations are tools for copywriters, for example, so for text. And then there's coding assistants. GitHub Copilot is a famous example. There's image generation tools, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion. And then there's a new class of tools around speech, which allow you to generate synthetic voices. But basically, for many of them, except for the speech area, for many of them, the interface seems to be a prompt. You type something and then it creates something. But I will turn it over to Mikio to tell us at a high level what the hell is in plain English.
Yeah, I'm trying. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. So somehow this came out of nowhere, right? So there was for a long time, there were these models that tried to generate images which looked natural, right? I think that one of the earliest things was like a network that would generate pictures from like that looked like celebrities, but that actually weren't people, right? So and they worked on this for quite a while just to get neural network to create something that looks real. And then I think what they did, they added sort of something that the networks can deal with text and images. And then it sort of evolved from there, that now you have something, so you have the images and you have text, and somehow the network learns the relationship between the two. And then you can start with the text and then have the network generate something that looks real, but also corresponds to what it is. And I think for a long while, it wasn't quite clear. So it's very impressive, right? So you can generate pictures or text, but it wasn't clear like what to do with it. But now we are starting to see these actual applications, and I think that and like a lot has happened there. I think the Stable Diffusion that just kicked off this year, and there was so much progress in a few months. Yeah, really impressive.
Is this the same technology that is fueling like the startups who are trying to make I forget the name of it now, but the startup a while ago, they'll generate news stories.
Oh,
you can feed it, like
narrative science.
box scores.
Yeah,
narrative science. Yes.
Yeah. So narrative science was much older technology. So Mikio, it would take structured data like whatever sports results,
sports scores. Yeah.
And then write a story, right? So but this is doesn't rely on any structured data. You just prompt it. So it seems like prompting, at least for now, prompting is still somewhat of a fine art.
Yeah.
So there are people who are master prompters, so they're called prompt engineers, right? So they can we can have all three of us prompt, for example, Stable Diffusion, but a master prompter will be able to get more out of it. And part of it is just that they're probably more patient typing all sorts of prompts until they get what they want, right? So,
So if you extrapolate this out a few years, what are some of the practical things we might see in the real world that you can imagine?
Yeah. I think for example, so like I said, so at least in two areas. So for text in the copywriting world, right? So so these are marketers, copywriters, people who have to produce press releases or social media posts. So there's already tools for them that are actually, some of these companies are doing quite well. And then for programmers, there's these coding assistants that are already proving popular. In fact, I'm a paying user of GitHub Copilot, and it's not that it will write an entire program for me, but it just makes me more productive because it eliminates my need to type large blocks of code that I would have typed anyway, but it would just kind of magically suggest it. And then that also means I don't need to know the details of syntax or APIs, because it kind of I mean, the end result is I would in the past I would have to look up the details of a syntax or API, but now with GitHub Copilot, I may not have to do that. So I can be much more productive. Now, on terms of the images and the video, I think the jury is still out in terms of, so there's hope that it would make designers, right? So much more productive, like the people who build things for games, for example, because that's a huge part of the cost of games, right? So is all the graphic design. So maybe, but the jury is still out. Same thing with speech. So.
Yeah, I saw one thing, or it actually was doing quite well, is where you can have the AI sort of you feed it with profile pictures of yourself, and then it generates them in different styles. So if you want to have like a flashy profile picture where you're an astronaut or something, it could generate that for you. And it seems to be, it looks quite interesting, right? So I think it will be, so you still need the designer, or I always think, right, you still need the human in the end, but like what they can do becomes more powerful because they have tools like that, and then they don't have to sort of do it by hand for a few hours, but they can just click a button.
All right. Well, our second trend that we're going to talk about this year is not really a new thing. We've been wrestling with large language models for a long time. So what's driving this trend for more tools for large language models?
Yeah, so I think this builds on that earlier topic we discussed, which is generative AI. A lot of generative AI is based on these large language models, or foundational models, as some people would call them. So then as they grow, as generative AI and these large language models become more widely used, people are clamoring for tools to help them evaluate them, right? So which one should I use? How do I compare these different large language models? How do I test that they actually will work for my use case, or they're robust enough to deploy? So I think we're still in the early stages. So just the last couple of months, there's been a couple of tools, one from Hugging Face, one from Stanford Center for Research on Foundation Models. And then I know for a fact that early next year, maybe later part of Q1 or maybe early Q2, there are more tools that will come out on the NLP side that will help people kind of test some of these models. Although I have to say the Helm tool from Stanford is quite interesting in the scope and how comprehensive it is. But I think this will be driven by kind of the requirement and need for people to before they actually use some of these things. Let's make sure they're safe, they're reliable, and that we're getting the best one for our use case.
What do you think, Mickey?
Yes.
Mikio, sorry.
Yeah. But I think also what is on the there's this pointer here to this detoxifying language models, right? So that's always these are just trained on like terabytes of text, and nobody really knows in the end what they will do. And I think there were quite a few examples where they would produce text that is very biased or something, right? So there's nothing in these models that helps them be like politically correct or anything, or so you have to make sure before you release any of that. I think the question is, well, how do you best do that, right? Because I mean, of course, so during training, everything's already evaluated and you have like high scores, but then you need maybe some more objective thing to test, and then also look for biases and so on.
Yeah, Jen, as Mikio was talking there, I was reminded that part of this is tools, but part of this is also just processes and things, right? So, for example, OpenAI has a team just for some of these kind of safety and detoxification steps.
So, is democratization of AI and ML sort of an overarching driver for developing these tools? Is that the focus? Is for it to be more accessible, or are we trying to do something different?
I think in this case, we're talking about the role of large language models in general, but in the area of generative AI in particular. So it seems like the types of things we're talking about here are specific to these large, opaque models, right? So that seem powerful, but people don't quite understand their limitations and how to compare them. So I think that's what we're talking about here, because we talk about large language models, but as the Stanford Helm study points out, there's no singular large language model. There's many of them. So how do you decide which one of them to use, right? So, and so on and so forth.
Okay. So related to this, our third topic, or third trend for this year is focusing on efficiency when training and maintaining models. So what is new in that arena? Are we looking at more different tools or processes, or all of it? And why?
Yeah, I think.
And how? I mean, how are people approaching it?
Yeah, I think this is again related to the rise of these large foundational models, right? And these models are not cheap to train. They're not cheap to deploy, and so people are trying to grapple with how are there ways for us to use these models or tweak these models in a more efficient and more efficient way, right? So and here there's various approaches that people are doing. So some of it has to do with data, right? So can we get by with fewer training data? Can we redesign the model? So maybe the model we're using uses a hybrid approach where part of it is neural network, part of it is information retrieval, right? So it doesn't have to know everything from scratch. Can we get by with a pre-existing model and just fine-tune it? And then on the deployment side, these are expensive to deploy because they're large models. Are there tricks there that we can employ to make deployment more efficient? And then there's kind of a more nascent group of people coalescing around this topic of sustainable AI and green AI. So this has to do with, just measuring the environmental impact of training this really large language models. I don't know the exact carbon footprint, but you can imagine models that take months to train, or what that entails. So one of the interesting initiatives here is actually from Meta, where they already have internal tools that kind of measure carbon footprint for some of these training workflows. And it's interesting because they also include, the carbon footprint of building all of the servers and hardware for training models. But these are early, but you can see that, so the mega trend is you have these large language models that are hot. Everyone wants to get their hand around large language models. So now you want to understand them and evaluate them before you deploy them. But if you're going to deploy them and use them, can you do it in a more efficient and sustainable way?
Yeah.
What are you seeing in this space, Mikio?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest helpers was actually platforms like Hugging Face, or like where people publish pre-trained models, because the initial training really takes months on like thousands of CPUs. And I think so some papers even, so you have a dollar number, like how much it costs to train the model, and it's just not sustainable, but also not feasible for many people. So having these things, that's really great. You can just pick one and then just add like a last layer and train that for your specific use case and so on. And I think all these also what's in the plot down here, there are all these tricks if you go to deployment, so you can quantize the model and all kinds of things, I think, which has been around for quite a while, but then you have to tune it for the specific models you're looking at. But I remember, like was it last year, Ben, that we had this, we cited that paper that sort of was extrapolating like how much we could still gain at which cost or something. What happened to that? Did we break through?
I think that I've spoken to some of the people who build large models, and they poo-pooed that paper a little bit in terms of the calculations. But I think I think set aside whether or not we're hitting kind of the end of deep learning in terms of accuracy and so on and so forth. I think the main thing here is, even if you are a true believer in pushing and pushing and pushing larger and larger and larger models, you still have to figure out how to do that, right? So without breaking the bank or without contributing too much to global climate change, right?
So is this looking at like putting pre-trained models out that you would then like have some sort of way to make it unique to your use case? You were mentioning something about that, Mikio. So is this like a company could buy something off the shelf and then train it for their specific use case?
Yeah, no, I mean, so you can on like Hugging Face. I mean, it's just one of them. I think there are also others, of course. But so you can just just download the model and then continue to use it, and you get that for free essentially. So it's if you want to deploy it using the tools on Hugging Face, then you have to start to pay. But so many people are publishing these models. Also, like in Germany, right? So they also have a version of these models just for German. So people are doing that and then putting that out there.
And I think to Mikio's point, there's these model hubs like Hugging Face, but the typical workflow, at least for NLP and computer vision, is take a pre-existing model, because honestly, some of these models you can't train yourself anyway, right? So you don't have access to the data even if you wanted to. And the question is, do you have the tools to take a pre-existing model, which probably works well off the shelf, but not well enough for you to deploy? Can you take that and fine-tune it? And so we're starting to see tools that allow people, at least in the computer vision and NLP setting, to do that. And the fine-tuning may require a few hundred more labeled examples for your specific use case. And it may even be a low-code or no-code tool. So person doing the fine tuning might be a physician or an oncologist who's labeling data, right? So, but those tools are still not widespread, I would say, but they exist. And so I think that's a trend as well, right? So
yeah, that could be very helpful for niche data use cases, like, well, the oncology thing, and where you might not have access to enough of the data.
Or the off-the-shelf model is good, but not good enough for oncology, right? So
right.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting. Well, our next trend kind of plays off of that, the continuation of automating and democratizing machine learning in software development. So, Ben, where's that coming from?
Yeah. So this is basically something that I've been talking to people about in recent months. So it's clear that, you have ML and AI tools now that cover the entire ML pipeline, right? But they tend to assume still a certain level of knowledge and expertise. So set aside the fact that you might be able to code, so you're a software developer, but you may not know anything about ML, right? So but if you look at the potential market of users for these tools, there's so many more, for example, analysts or developers compared to data scientists and ML engineers. So I think there's still a lot of room to make these tools accessible. So both to people with programming skills, developers, and people who may not be proficient programmers like analysts. So there's a lot of interest still in tools to maybe expand the scope of some of these automation tools, so the so-called AutoML tools, make them more useful for very targeted and specific use cases, so people are more likely to actually deploy and use them. But the general trend here is there's still a lot of room to make these tools simpler to use.
Yeah, I think especially like the whole, like, you need the right processes to make sure you don't, like, the models you train actually work, right? And so if you take like a purely software engineering approach and you just say, oh, it's a library, I can train it, I can deploy it and everything, but you have to sort of know what you're doing, and you have to properly evaluate models and make sure, like, training is like simple things like training and test data is separated and all of that. And that's still something that you have to know how to do, right? And I think so there's still a lot of room that all these, like, best practices actually become part of the framework, and then it also keeps you from doing the right thing, and thereby also making sure that the models actually perform well.
Yeah. Jenn actually have an example of someone we talked to in the past, Sean Taylor. So Sean Taylor co-wrote this library called Prophet, which is no longer based. There's better libraries now, right? So than Prophet, but Prophet was an example of taking an area, so time series forecasting or anomaly detection. Normally, you would need someone who's knowledgeable in statistics or something, econometrics, statistics, some machine learning. So what Prophet was able to do was basically open up time series forecasting to developer types. So that's kind of the what we're talking about here, is that maybe through a mixture of better explanations, more automation, you can open up some of these areas. So a recent example, for example, in time series forecasting, it's still not possible to do, obviously, because there's so many possible time series. It's impossible to just do automated forecasting, but maybe you can automate it enough so that someone with less knowledge of statistics or econometrics can be productive. And Amazon, actually, interesting enough, Amazon, I forget. I mean, it like multiple years. They now have a neural model that does a lot of automation for forecasting for them internally. But that Amazon team, first of all, took several years, and then they have like over 100 people on that team. so the hope is some of that tooling starts appearing more in the open source world, for example, right? So yeah.
And so this also feeds into our next trend, is seeing more tools for unstructured data in the areas, specifically in the areas of visual and audio data. So what are you seeing there, Ben?
So here, this is another area that kind of I wasn't looking at necessarily this year, but started really popping up all over the place on my radar. So I would divide this in three areas. The first one is text. So obviously, there's a lot of tools for storing and mining text, but more recently, because of the rise of embeddings, so embeddings in many ways have become the starting point for text. There's now a new class of libraries and frameworks and databases even for storing these embeddings. And kind of the main use case is nearest neighbors. So it's a lot of it is used for search, but as you know, I mean, searching through text is many applications, right? So vector databases, several startups there, many open source projects, and what I'm seeing there is that it now becomes easier for people to take these tools and become basically just as sophisticated as some of these tech companies in terms of search, for example. So that's text. So visual data, computer vision and speech were kind of the reasons why deep learning became popular to begin with. But what I'm finding out is actually the tools for managing all these types of data, visual data, for example, has lagged behind, right? So now we're starting to see more startups and more free tools. So I helped announce this free tool called FastTube, which you can use to wade through millions and millions of data. So they've pointed FastTube, for example, at many of these open visual data sets comprised of millions and millions of images. So they found mislabeled images, duplicates, and so on and so forth. So basic things that you take for granted for structured data. So FastTube in particular is written in C++. It's pretty fast. Now in audio, not as many tools, but there's starting to be a cluster of tools that people are calling the K2 ecosystem. And it's basically comprised of 3 projects, right? But basically, this is even earlier than visual data. So what this allows you to do is imagine kind of doing data processing for audio data. And the syntax would look like pandas kind of syntax for audio data, right? So the kinds of things, Mikio, that we take for granted in the structured data world are just beginning to appear in some of these other data types. I would say of these 3, the most mature is text because of the vector database and vector search use case. There's many open source projects and several well-funded startups in that space. Visual data, audio data, not so much, but given the potential applications of both data types or actual applications of both data types, I would say there should be and there will be more investment in tools in both those data types.
Yeah, I've been doing quite a few search projects lately, and vector search is really pretty hot, right? So the classical stuff is more like Lucene or Solr, so these old information retrieval engines. But then, so the hope if you do vector search is to even like if there isn't, so all the other things are really more like word match based, right? So they do some grammar processing, but then in the end it's still like, is the word in there or not? And if you want to search more by meaning or something, then that's a very interesting area. And then there's a whole ecosystem of stuff how to make that fast. Yeah, and everybody wants to get in there.
But there's a mixture of open source, hosted, cloud hosted projects, right? So and it seems like the nirvana for people here in Mikio is what they call hybrid search, which is a combination of semantic and keyword search.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, there's this Vespa search engine, which I think
out of Yahoo.
Yes. So somehow, and they have open sourced it, but they don't really want to do a business with it, it seems. But then that's like, I think, one of the gold standards. But there are many
there's
startups
I think there's Face out of Facebook, which is more of a library, and then the companies in this space are Pinecone, which is completely cloud hosted, proprietary, and then two open source projects that have become companies. One is called Weaviate, and then the other is Milvus.
Yeah, and there's I have to mention Gina AI, which is a Berlin-based startup.
Of course, Berlin. Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting. So our next topic is again not anything new, but we're going to see a renewed focus on streaming applications and data integration. So Ben, talk a little bit about why that's becoming a thing again. Well, I mean, it's always been a thing, but why is that bubbling to the top, and how are companies going to benefit?
So I think this is the streaming is more of a hunch on my part, partly because of one, the Spark community is putting a renewed focus on streaming. So they're going to probably really complete this next generation Spark streaming sometime next year, which means that probably at least because of the size of Spark, that will impact how people think of streaming. And then the second thing is there's many startups in the space, but Mikio, I don't know if you know, but there's at least a couple of startups around Flink again. So I think just a combination of kind of these coincidences, I think means that next year will be another kind of renaissance in streaming. And we do think that the people that master streaming will have a decisive edge, given that real-time decision-making is increasingly important. But we'll see. And then as far as data integration, again, this is driven by the fact that there's a lot of investment in this space. In many ways, what ties these two topics together is just, moving data around remains a core competency and a foundational technology in many companies. And then in the data integration space, there's a lot of investment across different layers of that data integration, including orchestration, but also there's a new set of tools that even make data integration more accessible. So the last few years has seen the rise of what people call the analytics engineer, right? So the people who write SQL mainly because of DBT, they've been able to kind of assume a much more engineering-oriented role. And so now it's like almost a step further in the sense that people are building some of these low-code, no-code tools for data integration again. Again, none of this is new. It's more of a renewed emphasis on the importance of streaming and pipelines.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the streaming is interesting because this technology has been around for a couple of years now, right? I mean, I
Oh,
also worked on.
your startup was streaming, right?
Yes, it was also. Then it turns out that often like sort of near time or like fast batches is fast enough, right? So it's always like so the I think the technical capabilities have been there for a couple of years, but yeah, like yeah, I also think every time. So in principle, it makes total sense, right? If you can process the data quicker, you can make decisions faster and so on. But somehow, sort of the killer application hasn't been found yet.
Or also I think the tools have always been hard to use, right?
Yeah, yeah. That's also. I think also yeah with Kafka streams and so on. So I've seen a few of those. It's still quite low level, and you have to know exactly what you're doing. And then so that what you mentioned with the data integration, right? I think what's also very interesting is so right. So we had this NoSQL and all of that, but there has been really like the return of the SQL paradigm and SQL databases and also right. So I think somehow after NoSQL, we started. When we had that, right, it was like, oh, we can't have all these like a real database because it cannot scale. But somehow we solved that problem, and now we have all these scalable SQL databases, and then people are using that to build data pipelines again, and I think it's I think that's good because SQL is like such an old technology, like the abstraction, right? So that's pretty mature. So I think that makes sense. And yeah, so I think DBT is what is there is quite mature. And then I think the other layer I found quite interesting is this orchestration stuff, right? So I think many people are still using Airflow, but which really is quite old by now. And then there are a couple of new things to do it better, I think. So very interesting.
All right, so moving on to our next trend, Ben and Mikio, you are thinking that data engineering roles will increasingly involve ops tasks. So what kinds of tasks and why is there this shift in their roles?
So again, this is more of a high level observation. Now with the maturation of these cloud warehouses and lakehouses and other managed services, that means data teams don't need to build a lot of these things on their own or piece together a lot of these things on their own, right? So they can get a lot more done and they can do it at scale. So that means they can focus more on applications and operations. And one important aspect of that is basically what people are calling FinOps, so managing cost and optimizing utilization and related topics. But other things that the teams are beginning to focus more on is governance, right? So data governance, which also includes knowing exactly what data you have. But yeah, so just generally a shift of focus. Instead of building things on our own, let's make sure we can serve the business and build the applications that we need.
Yeah.
And do you think that will result in a cost savings too?
I think this is where I think the next few years a lot of teams are going to focus more on how they manage costs, right? So this whole FinOps thing will become much more important, right? Because some of these managed services are easy to use and easy to get started, but maybe the costs go out of control unless you're paying attention. So I think this is a new competence for data teams.
Yeah. Yeah, I also think it's so overall, I think the area has matured. So no, but it's also becoming more complex. So governance has been taken much more seriously. But I think also people realize that it's good if you have a dedicated person for that, and don't let the data scientists build their own stuff, and then yeah, there's this new role that sort of knows about all of the tools and the processes and so on, and help enable data scientists in the teams. And that's really something I think that also matured the last few years.
And that also, again, our next trend kind of stems from that. So you're predicting that the AI and data teams are going to get caught flat-footed. You're quoting from the paper, will be caught flat-footed in the coming wave of regulations. So what new regulations are coming that you see, and why are we not prepared?
So at a high level, compared to the situation for GDPR, where companies were, unprompted talking about what they're doing about GDPR 18 months, 12 months out. For AI, I think given that there are going to be regulations that will come online next year, I have yet to come across an AI team or person who actually has even raised these coming regulations, right? So first of all, European AI Act probably will come online April or maybe a few months later. But already you have rules in New York that are scheduled to come online, New York City in January, District of Columbia, DC, Washington, DC, and then California is also looking at a few things. So we can talk a little bit about the EU AI Act, but in the US, one prediction is because there's going to be a hodgepodge of these rules, there might be pressure for Congress to do something, because I don't think companies like kind of having to react to different municipalities doing their own thing. So at a federal level, let's come up with something, right? Yeah, and then a lot of these rules focus on bias, fairness, and privacy. And some of the initial areas they target are hiring and all the software that human resources or people resources teams use are increasingly some of the initial use cases they target. So when I talk to my friends at B&H AI, which is the law firm I advise, which is the first law firm focused on AI and analytics, I asked them, given that there's such a hodgepodge of rules, what should data teams do? And their answer is, the best thing they could do is to operationalize the risk management framework for AI put out by National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. And NIST has this historic role, for example, in cybersecurity. The NIST cybersecurity framework is often cited in that space. So the idea is that maybe at some point, the NIST risk management framework for AI will be kind of something that teams will cite as well. So why should you consider operationalizing the NIST AI risk management framework? Well, because if you do, it shows good faith, right? So early next, or when these rules first come online, regulators come to you, you go, well, I operationalized the NIST AI risk management framework. They're more likely to say, okay, that's good enough for now. I have 100,000 other companies that I need to talk to, right? So, but yeah. So anyway,
but are these rules already published? I think with GDPR it was also that they're
the
so
EU,
they were known years before, right? So
the EU Act is already online. So all these are already online. The question is, are teams aware of them, and what will the penalty? So the EU, they do penalize, right? So they're not they're serious about enforcing things. So yeah, so the question is, so a lot of these rules, as you point out, Mikio, tend to be vague, right? So so it's hard to know exactly what to do. I mean, GDPR had the same problem as well, right? So
but I think GDPR was a bit simpler, right? Because it was mostly about the problem was data was mostly about data and
privacy,
like who uses it and so on. But AI, I mean, I followed a little bit of the discussion in different fields, but so it's not even clear, like, how do you define AI, right? So and then all of that, everything else also becomes very difficult. But
Yeah, like I said, the focus, as I read some of these rules, the focus seems to be on bias, fairness, and privacy. I mean, but you should take the entire responsible AI umbrella seriously. But if those are the two aspects of responsible AI that it seems to focus on: fairness and privacy. And like I said, it seems like some of the initial areas where the focus is as well is around hiring and employment management systems. But like I said, so maybe the best strategy is just to take the NIST framework and try to put your best faith effort to operationalize it. But the main thing is, the reason, Jen, I say teams will be caught flat-footed is because a lot of teams don't even know this is happening, right? So, for example, if you are operating in New York City and you have a tool that has something to do with employment decision making, you should be aware that in January those will be subject to this new regulation, right?
So isn't it a little strange that this is happening and nobody's really talking about it or being prepared for it? Why is this? Why or how is this happening?
I think part of it is, as Mikio explained, for example, the EU AI Act, which is the big one, is a bit hard to understand.
Oh, sure.
Exactly what it is that they're asking you to do. So that's why the advice is you should do something, and at least NIST tells you a few basic things you should be doing, right? So
yeah, I also remember with GDPR, many companies were a bit like, okay, let's sort of start putting some processes in place, but then at the end of the day, you don't really know like how this will practically be applied. And so everybody was sort of waiting for the first few lawsuits and hoping it's not them. And that's probably same with the ESO, right? So it's a bit like, okay, we have to, it's really risk management in a way. So you try to, so if it comes to it, you think you're in a good position because you cannot really say like what it will exactly mean. And that's maybe even worse within the AI Act.
Yeah, and honestly, at some level, I think the EU AI Act. I mean, this is complete speculation on my part. To some extent, targets large American tech companies, right? So, but that doesn't mean you yourself, even if you're a small company operating in EU, should do nothing, right? So you should do something, and I think that kind of operationalizing this NIST framework is sound advice, right? So,
okay, our last trend for this year, we're going to see.
Is it the last? We'll see.
We're doing 10. Oh, you have more?
Yeah.
Are we?
Yeah, we keep going.
Surprise trends.
No. There's additional topics. All right.
But so for our 10 trends, our 10th trend is we're going to see more AI and data startups, AI and data applications fueling more Pegacorns. So let's talk about who is doing this right now, like, and what kinds of applications are doing the best.
So first of all, Pegacorn is a term we made up because we were frustrated with the term unicorn, because the unicorn term increasingly became meaningless. So Pegacorn is a company, a startup, an actual startup that's not a public company, that's has at least 100 million in annual revenue. So when we did, so when we did our AI Pegacorn list, one of the things we noticed is a lot of the Pegacorns are actually application focused, right? So either they're building in applications for marketing and sales or cybersecurity or so on and so forth, instead of infrastructure companies, right? So and the reason for this is there's many more kind of interesting opportunities and use cases at the application layer. Whereas at the infrastructure layer, you can take a company like Databricks, and how many Databricks can you have, right? So, I mean, if Databricks takes care of the infrastructure, then pretty much that's it, right? So, so, you know, I mean, the funding for AI is a lot tougher compared to what it was when we last talked last year, but there are still companies being funded. And already, actually, there are new Pegacorns that are not on this list that we did in April. And
What's an example? Like, is there
I don't know I don't know if they're actual unicorns, but one example would, for example, would be a company that with healthy revenue on the application layer would be Jasper, right? So Jasper is kind of this I guess generative AI startup for copywriters, marketers, right? So very, very focused on, you want to write a press release or a blog post or a social media post and so on and so forth. But yeah, so there will be more companies like that. We believe that can target specific use cases and applications that will grow and generate healthy revenue. But you know, if I were starting a company, part of the reason I put this here is for people who are listening. If I'm starting a company, I wouldn't start it at the infrastructure layer. Let's put it that way.
What do you think, Mikio?
Yes, no, it's I think the whole infrastructure area is quite difficult, right? Because it's sort of part of it is open source, and then there are all these big cloud providers. So I think concrete applications are always a good thing to do if it's B2B, right? So it's also quite scalable. And as Ben said, so there's just more opportunity there. So more to find something. So it's a bit it's a bit newer still. So infrastructure is a bit like
it requires a slightly different mindset and skill set, right? So because some of the more successful AI Pegacorns, for example, on the application layer, most people in our audience, even if they knew the company, they wouldn't know a single person on the AI or ML team, because that's not what they do. They don't publish papers. They don't write cool blog posts about their models. They just build useful shit for people. So.
Yes. All right. Well, shall we move on to the bonus trends?
Yes.
The bonus trends section.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, AI and geopolitics.
Yes. Ben. So I mean, here, as many people know, apologies, Mikio, but in the world of AI, it's really a two-horse race between China and the US. For the last several years, right? So you can look at any number of metrics: startup funding, publications at conferences, and so on and so forth. But now you have what appears to might happen is a slight decoupling of China from the rest of the world, right? So there are now export controls for a class of chips that are critical for building some of these AI models. So given that in the past, there's relatively nice cooperation and back and forth between China and the rest of the world. I mean, look, I co-chaired the conference in China for 4 years. Mikio went to the last one, which was on AI. So there was definitely much more of an open dialogue between China and the rest of the world. So it's hard to say what these export controls and kind of this environment of competition will mean for AI research in particular moving forward.
Yeah, Yeah, not much to add here. I mean, but the whole global situation is
But you can
shifting a lot this year anyway. So
you can tell us. So what do people in Europe think about all these export controls?
I mean, I haven't really not talked about this too much with people.
Yeah.
But yeah. I mean, I think Europe, right? So Europe sees like all of Europe versus the US. And I think the Europe always had a healthy like machine learning research area, but at least while I was still there. But I think what has really changed is that it has become so resource intensive, right? So only like a Google or Facebook has the resources to train all these huge models.
In the data, right? So
yeah, the data, yes.
Yeah.
And then I mean, if you just as you said, right? So China really picked up like a lot in the last 10 years or so. But then at the same time, I think also like accelerated by COVID, right? So there's also a bit of a divide between the rest of the world and how China are dealing with it, and let's see where this leads. Yeah, but there was also this thing I read that there's some, I think a Dutch company which produces these machines which you need for chip printing, and then I think they
extreme ultraviolet lithography, ASML. But the key there is that some of the critical components, ASML actually is their main skill is they assemble all these really cutting edge parts. But some of the key parts are from the US. So, and some of their investors are US. So they're covered, I think, by this export controls as well.
Yeah, but didn't they stop shipping to China or something? Or
yes, yeah. Yeah.
So let's see.
All right. So in the world of security, what major trends are you noting?
So
new stuff.
So people have heard us talk about privacy preserving machine learning and analytics, so that continues to forge ahead. But I'm actually for this conversation, I want to surface two topics we normally don't talk about. First is ransomware, which continues to be a big problem, which people don't talk about enough in our community, in the AI community. The second thing is the software supply chain for AI, which relies a lot on Python. But anyone who installs any meaningful Python library will notice if you pip install that library, it tries to install so many things, right? So there's so much dependencies in the Python ecosystem. And last year there were attacks already on the Python supply chain, Python software supply chain. So maybe there will be more. I assume there will be more because it's just such an interesting target for people, right? So
yeah, and also I think the Python itself is not very hardened against this kind of thing, right? I think similar to on the front end side, there will also be these cases where people were taking over an open source project that was used in almost any like a dependency for millions of packages, and then they would just update, and then you suddenly had this malware running on your browser. And with Python, I think technically the same things can happen. So somebody can sort of take over an open source project, push like one commit that has some malware in it, and then people may not even realize that somebody's sort of sniffing their data or something like that. And I think so in the language there's nothing that so there's no like security concept like in Java or so. So
wasn't there a recent discussion about and I'm not a software engineer, so I no coming from left field here, but a recent discussion about using Rust for security purposes because it had better defenses or a better way to avoid or protect against this kind of thing?
Yeah, Rust is a separate kind of community and use case in some ways. So let's say you're building a database. Yeah, you'll probably write it in Rust. But if you're doing data science, machine learning, the Python library, the Python ecosystem of libraries is just too big. And not only the existing ones, but most new things, most new research papers come with Python code, not Rust code, right? So, yeah. So, but like I said, if you're writing a vector database, you're probably going to write it in Rust. But for ML and AI, it's Python, right, Mikio?
Yes, for better or worse, it's Python. No, it's just the ecosystem, like any library exists, and I think that's what everybody knows. But sort of from a so it's not a very it's so right. Also originally it was a scripting thing. Don't want to say a bad thing about Python here, but it's not very secure. Or, yes.
All right. So another trend, a bonus trend that we're looking at is, again, nothing new, but more tools for multi-cloud use.
Yeah, so I think the multi-cloud becomes more and more possible for people doing machine learning and data. So there's more tools. And it also ties with the previous topic we talked about, which is if people are concerned about costs. So if this whole FinOps area is something that people are starting to embrace, some of these multi-cloud tools factor costs in mind, costs and performance in mind. So yeah, so for example, Skyplane, right? So there's two projects from Skylab and Berkeley. Skyplane allows you to basically move data around between clouds cheaper. So
yeah, it's still very expensive, right? So I think so if you deploy a web server or something, so this thing will usually sit idle unless you're really big. But the problem with this, like AI workloads, is that it's very compute intensive. So you need a big machine, and then you need it for a few days, and then you can easily spend a lot of money. So I think anything that makes that easier is really good.
What about the companies who are working in this area to provide that service for other companies? So let's say your team needs to use multi-cloud, but setting up that infrastructure internally is going to be too expensive, so you hire an outside company. Do you see that becoming a bigger thing, or is that also just going to be too expensive and it'll be cheaper ultimately to do it in-house?
I think it has to do one. Can you actually execute and build the application you want multi-cloud? If it is, then I think there are tools for you to use, right? So if you're doing machine learning and analytics, for example, so BigQuery, Omni, for example, from Google Cloud is multi-cloud by design. Yeah, so I think this is a continuation of something we talked about last year, but it just seems like there's more progress in terms of people being able to utilize multiple clouds, but do it in a way that doesn't sacrifice performance and might actually come out cheaper.
Yeah, I think they also, I saw a service where you could sort of rent a GPU instance somewhere, right? So they would say they make you a good price and then you get it. But then, of course, you have the problem to get the data there and all of that. And I think that's where these services can help. I think that the problem with multi-cloud, the challenge with that is always that, so if you really want to be multi-cloud, you cannot use any specific services, or you have to have this extra layer that sort of abstracts that away. And that's a lot of work, right? So and there's always this argument that you say, okay, let's say if you use AWS and then we start using all these AWS services, but then if you want to switch at some point to something else and we have to rewrite everything, And then they do this, that they sort of already try to abstract everything away from it, but that's almost like you have the migration costs already, although you never know whether you need them or not. So I think it's really not that easy to figure out like what is a good spot here. But having these services can help a bit, because then somebody already took care of the abstraction layer.
All right. Well, we can end our trend discussion by poking a very hot topic. So Twitter is imploding. And the question, not just for the data community, but for everybody, is where are we going to go? So what are your thoughts? Where are the data scientists going to gather?
So where are the AI, machine learning, data science, data engineering, Twitter, where are they going to go? So I'm seeing three things. The first one centers around ActivityPub, which is a decentralized protocol for building, for example, social media websites. So there's already kind of the most interesting manifestation there is Mastodon, but it's really more around ActivityPub that I think people should focus on. So, for example, Tumblr has announced that they will support ActivityPub. WordPress already has a plugin. So, believe it or not, my podcast you can follow on Mastodon. not that I want you to follow my podcast on Mastodon, but I think ActivityPub will lead to more things, maybe beyond Mastodon. Who knows, right? So, but this is much more of a federated model, right? So the second thing I'm seeing is the kind of a bunch of centralized services kind of stepping forward and saying, hey, if you're unhappy at Twitter, you should check us out. So obviously there's Discord, there's a new site called Post, and a bunch of other sites. But I think centralized might be a little harder for people to commit to, given their experience in Twitter, right? So maybe Twitter was this kind of unique point in time when centralized services could dominate. But now that you have this example of what's happening in Twitter, where overnight all the investment that you put in as a community could not disappear, but could get altered, then maybe you're better off controlling your destiny. And then the final thing I'm seeing is built around another open source project called OStatus, but that's less interesting than ActivityPub, which seems to be the one that people are really building around. So if I were to predict, I think there will be a lot of groups moving towards the federated services, some groups going to more centralized services. But as far as what proportion, I don't know, but I would suspect more people, at least initially, will try out the federated services. And who knows, maybe Twitter will turn things around. But I think for now, given the fact that people have come to realize that, hey, we should build things that we can control ourselves, I think the federation may take hold. Now, the problem here, of course, is you lose the convenience of the centralized feed and all of the machine learning that you can do if you have centralized services. And also, federation doesn't really eliminate the problem of content moderation, right? So at the end of the day, content moderation is the product. Unfortunately, that's what the new owners of Twitter have failed to realize. But
right.
So
well, it does distribute the content moderation, though, right?
Yeah. But then that means that content moderation will be, as you point out, Jen, distributed, uneven, right? So I could be on a server with strict content moderation, and you could be in one that's less strict, and so on.
Yeah.
So one thing I don't understand is the difference between, so I just started a Mastodon account, and there's at least on the server I'm on, you can hit a federated stream and it gives you all of the Mastodon instances, all of the posts and all of the instances. So how is that different?
I don't think that's
Twitter?
accurate. I think
No?
what happened, I think when you hit that stream, you get the streams from every instance where you follow at least one person.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's say you follow 20 people. They're all on to all 20 people are in different Mastodon instances. I think that means you will get the feed from all those instances, but there could be 5,000 Mastodon instances, right?
Okay. I'll have to look into that, but yeah, I can see now why people are saying that especially for geopolitical reasons, if there's crises or something like that really needs a worldwide amplification, the loss of Twitter will be huge for that sort of use case.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of benefits for centralization, right? So one, just probably, you have more quality control, but also less quality control.
Right.
As we're seeing now, right? So, but also you have access to all that data, so your ranking and your feeds could be better, your recommendations could be better, and also, yeah. But then, but then it's the expense too. So federation also has doesn't eliminate content moderation, but also doesn't eliminate the need to figure out how to support the different servers, right? So,
yeah, but I think one hope I have, and I haven't really looked into ActivityPub yet, but is that it also makes the data more open again, right? So you remember in the beginning of Twitter, like I did, so you could get a feed and then do like all kinds of data analysis and look for trends and stuff like that. And with ActivityPub, I think now in principle that's also you could just write your own client that is not a Mastodon instance, but just consumes the data and does some data analysis. And then I think that could be interesting.
Yeah,
overall.
the only question there is now you don't have a single fire hose, right?
Yeah.
Right. So
how that all scales is also not really.
And even if you have multiple fire hoses, maybe there's who knows? So let's say there's a protocol that allows you to get feeds from all of the instances, but I'm sure some instances will say no, opt out, right? So we'll say,
which is also okay, but
yeah, so which means you won't get everything. But the nice thing about this whole rise of ActivityPub, which by the way, right before we started this episode, I was in a LinkedIn chat with my friend Evan, who basically wrote this many years ago. And I told him, hey, the stuff you worked on years ago is now huge again. So the nice thing about this, the rise of ActivityPub, as Mikio points out, is just the sense of people being excited that now they can do something, right? So whereas Twitter, as Mikio points out, Twitter made a big deal early on about their API and being open to developers, and then they changed their minds. Right?
Yeah.
And now no one controls it. So now people, and who knows, maybe someone will build something around this protocol that doesn't exist yet. That will be something a lot of us will gravitate towards, because Mastodon is nice, but I don't know if that's the end point, given that it's Ruby on Rails.
Nothing against Ruby on Rails. So the first version of TwinPack was actually written in Ruby on Rails.
Yeah.
It was back in the days. Yeah. No, but I agree. It's something's happening. It feels like, or people are saying like this, like felt like
So
back like 10 years. Yeah.
let me ask you two. So would you bet on would you bet everything on a centralized platform? In other words, you stop posting on one of these federated things, and because I'm on Post, but I'm not gonna only post on Post, because I mean, who knows what's going to happen there, right? So
Yes.
what's their business model? And in fact, right now I'm trying to encourage them to support two-factor authentication, which is crazy that they don't have. I mean, given that their model is micropayments for articles. So wait, so I'm gonna put my credit card information and you don't even have 2FA? No way. Even
Yeah, that's
Mastodon,
crazy.
even Mastodon has 2FA, right? So
This is even legal.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I mean I'm a bit more like old school internet. So I think the original idea of the internet was decentralized. I think that's some version of that. I think also I wrote a blog post like also 10 years ago, and I reread it the other day. But I think it's also there's more room for experimentation if it's decentralized, right? So you can try different business models. You can sort of pay by like how many followers you have, or you can have people pay for who they can follow and so on. I think a bit of the problem of these big platforms is that it's easy to get stuck. Like I think like Twitter was for a long time.
Yeah, so the question is, so how will these instances end up being able to support themselves, and how can they scale content moderation?
Yeah.
Right? So let's say you have an instance that becomes popular. How do you scale content? Jen, the other week, was telling me I should start my own Mastodon instance. I said, there's no way. I don't want to do content moderation, right? So.
Yeah. Yeah, it actually came up in my Mastodon instance today. The fellow who's running it had put up a Patreon account, and then so many people jumped in and joined it, and he's like, I don't know what to do with all this money. And he's like, I've spent, I don't want to, I'm trying to be very transparent about this. I don't want to just, pay myself. I feel weird about paying myself, but it's too much money to use to just support the servers and whatnot. So he wanted input from the community on what they should do with the money. And a lot of people said, hire help.
Let me ask
and
you
pay
this,
yourself. Yeah.
So what will happen once Tumblr turns on ActivityPub, which means you can follow anyone on Tumblr or on Mastodon? That'll be interesting, right? Because Tumblr also, I don't know what content moderation they have on there, right? So
I honestly didn't know Tumblr was still a thing.
Tumblr is now owned by Automatic, which also owns WordPress.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So
and I've never ever looked at WordPress as a social activity sort of platform at all.
Well, back in the day, blogging, before microblogging, blogging was social, considered social.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
So then now Tumblr is somewhere in between, right? Because it was never meant for long, expansive blog posts. It was more like memes and things like that.
Right. I think I posted photography on there.
Yeah. So then you can imagine having a commercial company also turn on ActivityPub, not just Tumblr, someone else, right? So, but that means it's exciting because
well, maybe that's the solution, right? Then you can network all of these distributed instances of these distributed platforms.
Yeah, and then with this protocol, you can always turn off if a certain node becomes Nazi, right?
Yeah.
You can just disconnect it, right? So,
what is it called? Defederate or something? I think there's even a word for it.
Yeah. So the question in my mind, so Twitter and Facebook during the Arab Spring, right? So played a pivotal role, but obviously now probably all these authoritarian governments have much more defense mechanisms around centralized platforms. I wonder if these federated platforms can do a better job for those kinds of scenarios. I don't know, right? So
Yeah. All right. So this is probably the longest podcast episode we've ever recorded. I just realized we're closing in on an hour and a half. So let's go ahead and close this episode quickly with the thing you're most excited about this coming year. Ben.
So I think honestly for me, it's just federation of media, because the other things I'm a lot more confident in terms of figuring out what will happen. This I have no idea what will happen, right? So which makes it more exciting.
All right, Mikio.
Yeah, no, I think I was always liked social media and all that. And I think the interesting thing is, so where's Web3, right? So nobody
Oh
you
yeah,
would have thought that Web3 would
Yeah.
come along and say, look,
I
we have
just,
this social
my
media
mo-
on a blockchain, but
my most popular toot, I guess is what they call it on Mastodon so far, is when I tooted yesterday, this activity pub is more interesting than any blockchain.
yes,
Speaking of decentralization, right?
exactly. I think that's, yeah. But let's see, that's an interesting area to have. So,
Yeah.
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 And then I think
All
I
right.
think all this AI content generation, I think it's just kicking off. Let's see what we get next year. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
With that, thank you both.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, guys.